Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Last Line of Defence, How to Protect Government Data from Cyber Attacks. I'm Siobhan Bonita, I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, that's a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world, and in partnership with our knowledge partner today, Rubrik. So in terms of today's topic, the National Data Strategy identifies data as being the driving force behind the UK's economy. However, government departments and agencies are facing increased threats to their data as cyber attacks and other online risks proliferate. According to government figures, 39% of UK businesses have identified a cyber attack in 2022, and in the public sector, attacks can halt the delivery of vital public services, causing huge disruption and damage. Organisations are spending a lot of money on online tools and better training for staff to protect themselves and valuable data from attacks. And in this webinar, we're going to be sharing insights from government and public sector organisations on how they have faced and survived cyber attacks, their approaches for making sure that the vital national assets of data remain protected at all times. And we'll consider how civil servants and public servants should be assessing the security of their data, preparing for increasing threats, and ensuring that their department or agency can continue to provide services. I think I was put on mute there. I'm unmuting myself. I hope that's okay. No. We have a fantastic expert panel with us here today. We've got three brilliant speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. But just to say for the audience, this is your opportunity today to put your questions to our great panel. So once they have spoken, there will be an opportunity to get through as many of those questions as possible. So whichever device you are on, you should see somewhere on that device a Q&A function. Please use that Q&A function at any time. So from now on, at any time throughout the webinar, to send in your questions, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can before the end of today's webinar. So in terms of our fantastic expert panel today, first we will hear from Michael Mestrovic, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at Rubrik. He brings with him a wealth of experience in private and public sector IT and security leadership. Most recently, before this current role, he was the CIA's Chief Information Security Officer, where he led the agency's cyber defense operations, developing and implementing cybersecurity regulations and standards, and directed the evaluation and engineering of cyber technology. So it's great to have Michael with us here today. Then we will hear from Glenn Heimers, who is Head of Data Privacy and Compliance at the CDIO Directorate in the Cabinet Office, where he's been since 2012. His background is in policing and security, including work in the RAF on counterintelligence, counter-espionage and counter-terrorism, and in the private sector, including as Fujitsu's Head of Operational Security and Risk Management, and also worked in the third sector as Chief Security Officer at the Prince's Trust and Save the Children International's Global CISO and Head of Data Protection. And then finally, we will hear from Phil Huggins, who is the National CISO for Health and Social Care. Phil has over 25 years of experience in security and technology roles. He has designed and operated security for critical national infrastructure and advised global financial services organizations and national regulators on cyber resilience and cybersecurity. In his current role, Phil sets systems cyber policy, strategy and architecture for the health and social care system. He leads on health cyber funding with the Treasury and commissions NHS Digital to deliver data security services to the NHS system, and leads on national cyber incidents in healthcare in partnership with NHS Digital. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we really do have a stellar panel with us here today. As I say, please do take this opportunity to message in your questions. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Michael to give us his opening remarks. Over to you, Michael.
Great, and thank you for having me here. You know, I think what's always important in these discussions is to kind of set the stage for the discussion. And in this discussion, I thought it was helpful if we kind of helped the audience understand kind of the state of cybercrime today. So just a few statistics on this. Cybercrime is on track to be about a $10.5 trillion business by 2025. And just putting that in perspective, that would make cybercrime the third largest economy on the planet. And so I think it's important for people to understand that this truly is a business. There is significant monetary value that's driving the pace of cybercrime. And organizations need to understand that there's the motivation behind cybercrime is obviously, a lot of financial gain. By way of businesses, it's argued that it is the most profitable business, more profitable than all the illicit drug trade on the planet. In the UK alone, 60 nationally significant cyber attacks were dealt with last year. In fact, the chief of the National Cybersecurity Center just most recently was interviewed, and Lindy Cameron said that ransomware was the most acute threat facing the country today. UK councils continuously being hit by cyber attacks, 10,000 cyber attacks every single day, 81% of UK healthcare organizations suffering a ransomware attack over the course of the past year. And the NHS is still dealing with the cyber attack that they had this past August. And potentially, of all these, the most troubling is that 94% of security leaders, UK security leaders, when surveyed, and this came out of a recent Rubrik Zero Labs survey, 94% of UK security leaders reported a significant emotional or psychological impact based on cyber attacks. So this is not only is this having an economic impact on our organizations, but it's also having an emotional and a psychological impact on those that we have asked to step up and defend our organizations from cyber attack. So with that, let me go ahead and pass the baton. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. I mean, setting the scene like that, just the scale of the challenge that we have there. Third largest business on the planet, hugely profitable in terms of the cyber attacks. Thousands of attacks a day affecting UK organisations, UK institutions. And then, as you say, not just having an economic impact, but also having a real emotional impact on the public servants that are tasked with trying to defend those organisations. So really great to set the scene with that, just that scale of the challenge. Thank you so much. Glenn, coming over to you.
Yeah, I mean, Michael paints a pretty bleak picture, and one that's not getting any better. And yeah, I can only, having done all of that area, and agree with what he's saying. So what can we do in government, and what do we need to focus on? So in our areas, we need to be focusing on those things that are likely to cause us our greatest headaches. What are our areas of critical national infrastructure? What are those threats that we need to deal with sooner rather than later? And we should be looking to focus on those threats in the first instance. And the biggest thing that we can take away, or at least my view on it is that I don't think striving for 100% compliance in security is ever going to work, because it's not a total thing. You cannot be 100% compliant with everything. And I don't think we could ever get to 100% secure. The tactics, the techniques, the procedures of the people on the other side move a lot faster than ours. We are responding. We're a very defensive type of environment. We're responding to attacks rather than trying to proactively get ahead of them, because we don't have that capacity, and we don't have, I said the talent, that's not the right word, but it was alluded to in the previous slide set that 22% of the organizations are dealing with insufficient talent. There's the cyber gap, and I know there's a lot of work going on to try and transfer those individuals who might be on the, in inverted commas, wrong side of the fence to come over to our side of the fence. But where's the incentive? If it's a lot more profitable, as to Michael's point, it's a lot more profitable to be on that side of the fence than it is to be on the good guys. So why would you do it if you're on the bad side already? And then I think the biggest, we were talking about this in the green room earlier, I think one of the biggest issues we've got is that third-party supply. As we outsource more and more to third-party suppliers, software as a solution, cloud as a platform, all of those types of things, we need to be making sure we can put our arms around the threat that comes from that. And how do we address that? How do we do that? Is it through the use of NIST? Is it through the use of those frameworks and using that? But again, it comes down to that lack of talent, lack of cyber talent. We can only do so much, and they can only do so much. It's a very cliched saying, and I don't really like trolling it out, but I'm going to, is that they've got to be lucky once, we've got to be lucky all of the time. And if we can't be lucky all of the time, I mean, this goes back to my point earlier about the 100% secure, then there's always going to be a glimmer of hope that we can do. I think from a government's perspective and from our perspective, it's all around hardening it, making it more difficult to attack us than it is to attack someone else. Make us a harder target. Let's not make us an easy target. And I think that's where we should be looking to concentrate and do all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's my view on it. And at that point, I shall hand over the baton to Mr. Huggins.
Thanks, Glenn. Just before we go over to Phil, so we've already had a question come in about third-party cloud-based solutions. So I'm going to pick up on that on the questions straight after. But interesting point that you said, they can't strive for 100% compliance. We're always going to be responding. It's ever-changing. And that issue about lack of cyber talent, I think we'll come back to that in the questions as well, because I think that's such a massive challenge for the public sector in particular. Thanks so much, Glenn. Phil, over to you.
Hi, thank you. So the title of this webinar is, how do we protect government data? And absolutely, we hold some government data for the purposes of government, but often what we're talking about is citizen data, or in my case, patient data. And we don't hold that because it's nice to have. We hold that because it underpins critical services that we provide to patients and to citizens. And fundamentally, the biggest threat the service provision arm of government faces is ransomware, is disruption as a result of destructive cyber attacks that interrupt our ability to provide the services that our citizens and our patients rely on. So fundamentally, we need to ensure that we're not only protecting our systems, protecting our data, but that we are prepared for when the 100% security isn't delivered, because it won't be, that we are prepared to minimize the impact of anything that occurs. Because the sooner we can minimize that impact, the sooner we can get back to providing services back to patients and back to citizens. For us, we had a significant wake-up call in the NHS in 2017. It predates my time in the role, so I'm going to claim a lot of credit here for things I haven't done. But suffice to say, it was a shock to the system. It highlighted really strongly the dependence that we had developed on technology to provide healthcare services, and put it right at the heart of the agenda of healthcare services. It was a shot in the arm that I think other people have had later. We very much turned our focus to protecting NHS organisations themselves. We have seen attacks since then, and I think through our capabilities that we've built, we have managed to see them off for the most part. We've managed to interrupt them, we've managed to disrupt them before they've managed to cause that disruption to us. The way we did that is significant investment initially into central services. We're a sector of organisations, all independent. Fixing this for every organisation was never going to work. Being able to suddenly inject talent, suddenly inject funding, suddenly inject technology into a sector of the economy was not going to happen. So by investing centrally, we were able to staff up, we were able to skill up, and we were able to provide services out to multiple organisations, raising the bar everywhere at the same time. And what I will say is, prior to WannaCry to more recent, we've seen a 10-fold reduction in cyber attacks into the NHS. And I would say actually part of that is because we won't pay a ransom, and we're not therefore that very attractive to ransomware operators. Some of the key things that we put in place, probably two that are worth bringing out. One is what's known as high severity alerts. So everybody always has new vulnerabilities, new issues that turn up in their equipment. Nobody has enough people or time to fix everything. And in fact, most vulnerabilities are never exploited. So it's actually a waste of money and time to try and fix everything. What we do is we sit down when major vulnerabilities are released for software or equipment that we believe is widely deployed across the system. We look for active exploitation. If we can find it, we have an alerting system that goes out to everybody in the system, every organization, and says, tell us in 2 days if this affects you, tell us in 2 weeks if you fixed it. And that has dramatically changed the hardening of the healthcare system. So it's not that we're trying to fix everything. It's not that we're saying we're trying to get to 100% remediation. We're focusing on those things that can hurt because they're being used and because we're exposed to them. But we're setting quite tight deadlines on making sure those things are sorted out, and that has borne fruit. The other thing is we've invested in a central cybersecurity operations centre, incredibly well run by our NHS Digital colleagues. We've got somewhere in the region of 2.1 million devices under management at the moment and growing. And it's presented us with a real opportunity. So the complexity of our healthcare system is such that it is actually really quite difficult to protect, because I'm looking at 140,000 odd organisations, all of which have some slight difference in the way their business operates, in the technology they use, in the environments they operate in. Through the Cybersecurity Operations Centre and the scale that we've been able to achieve, we're able to spot an attack and within 45 minutes disable that attack nationally. And I don't say that as a pat on the back. This was done before I got there, so I just, they did really well building this. But yeah, those two things, being able to focus on the vulnerabilities that actually mattered and being able to respond to events fast enough at scale, has had a significant difference. Like I said, a 10-fold reduction in the number of cyber attacks we've seen in the NHS, let alone the healthcare sector as a whole. So a couple of real things there to focus on from the cyber point of view. Those that have been keeping an eye on UK press will have seen that we had a major cyber incident in one of our suppliers in August. It wasn't one of our systems, it was their systems. It was an interesting experience to be outside the incident looking in when we were so dependent on it. But what that has done is it has shown that our focus on the NHS organisations over the last few years has paid off. And we now need to shift our focus back out onto the supply chain. So we are setting new expectations, and we're prioritising product and service assurance over organisational assurance. And that's one of those things that security assurance people will understand the difference between the two. But we've spent too much time relying on organisations having a badge and not enough time looking at what they're selling us. And I think that's going to change with the new expectations that are coming through. So we've got a big journey ahead of us there. We spent the last 5 years trying to fix a huge system. Now we're going to spend the next 5 years trying to fix a huge supply chain. And we're just at the foothills of that. So maybe I'll come back in 5 years and tell you how it's gone. That's me.
Thanks so much, Phil. I mean, just the scale of what you are facing is, almost too much to kind of comprehend. But interesting to hear what you said there. The biggest threat to the NHS and social care is ransomware. Was I right in hearing that you said that you never pay ransomware?
If somebody's life was in danger,
yeah, of
course, it's not like we would never pay. Okay. But our default position is not to pay ransomware. All it does is it encourages it further. Yeah. So, we will save someone's life when we can save someone's life. That's our purpose in life, and that's what we will do. But outside of that, we're not going to pay it.
Okay. Be interesting. I might come back to you, Michael, on that, because I want to ask you what's going on in the US, because I know you're US based. And my understanding is I think in the US they have paid quite a lot of ransomware, but I might be wrong on that, but I'm going to come back to you on that. But also just what you said there, Phil, about how you've had to also, picking up on what Glenn said, you can't cover everything. So you've really focused in on prioritizing those areas of most vulnerability, but also that central investment, which is allowing you to respond at pace and at scale. So quite impressive in terms of what you've managed to do with the resources that have been available to you. So thank you very much, Michael, Glenn and Phil, for setting the tone for the conversation with those opening remarks. Michael, I do very quickly then want to come back with you on this issue of, well, one, I'll pick up on what Phil said. Does the US government pay ransomware? But secondly, is there, from your experience of what's going on in the US, are there things that the UK government should be sharing with the US and the US government should be sharing with the UK? I'm sure there is collaboration there, but in terms of working together on good practice in this area.
Yeah, so 2 points on that. First, I think this was the US Treasury reported this about 2 weeks ago, I think. The US Treasury reported that US banks had paid out over $1 billion in ransomware payments. And that was in the course of this past year. That's not the US government paying, it's US banks processing payments for ransomware on the tune of about $1 billion. I'm pretty sure that was a CNN article that I saw about 2 weeks ago. But as a policy, no, U.S. government, and for that matter, state and local governments, as a matter of practice, do not pay ransomware. It is a crime. They do involve law enforcement agencies. They attempt to recover, obviously, the data that was stolen if they can. And then, obviously, the FBI has been noted in the news on several occasions, having gone after cyber criminals and actually recovering, in some instances, the ransom that has been paid previously. That being said, I just was reading an IDC study. An IDC survey conducted over the past summer. It's about split. About 50% of the respondent organizations ended up paying the ransom. About 50% did not. I think that what was interesting in that study was about 50% of the organizations, when they were hit with a ransomware event, never recovered their data. And that was even in instances when they actually paid the ransom. About 15% of them never got their data back because the encryption didn't work. So paying your ransom isn't necessarily a guarantee that you're going to get your data back. And I forget whether it was Phil or Glenn, but they both mentioned that we don't have to be 100% effective. This is the old adage of I don't have to be faster than the bear. I just have to be faster than you. So organizations don't necessarily have to have the best cyber defense, but they need to have the cyber defense that's effective enough such as that are not the target for the cyber criminals. They don't want to be the weakest link, and they want the criminals to end up going somewhere else. And so when I talk to organizations, I think this gets down to economies of scale, which both Phil and Glenn have mentioned. It's about understanding your critical data first and foremost, and where is that critical data, and then applying the necessary protections at those points in order to maximize the effective protection of your data. Because you're right, we're never going to be 100%. We don't have the resources to secure everything 100%. And even if we did, we can't control human beings. And as we all know, phishing attacks, social engineering, these are the predominant ways that criminals get into our environment. And that's a human problem more so than it is a technical problem at times.
Yeah, thanks. We've had this question in, as I mentioned, from Darren 40, and Darren asks, if government data is stored on third-party cloud-based solutions, how can we guarantee that sensitive data is secure if we, the government, don't own the physical infrastructure? So I'm going to put that, Glenn, you're nodding. Would you like to have a first stab at answering Darren's question?
Yeah, definitely. So this is where, for those of us that have been in government a while, will understand the same when I say information assurance. So this is where your assurance functions come into play here. So as part of that, what we should be doing as reputable data holders, etc., is doing our due diligence on the organization. Yes, we don't own the physical infrastructure, but what we can do is go in and ask for copies of all reports, etc., to show that they are fulfilling their requirements as per the contracts. For those that operate in the UK, we have a number of frameworks, and to be on those frameworks, then you have to have certain levels of security to make sure that that's fit for purpose. And that's where the assurance teams come in, to go into those organizations as part of the contract tendering. And then therein is the next piece, which is to make sure that it's done regularly, to keep an eye on those organizations, to Phil's point about what are those attack vectors, what are those areas that are being exploited in the wild, and making sure that those vulnerabilities are patched, those vulnerabilities are dealt with. And that comes into your third-party supply. And concentrating and having teams whose job it is just to do that and keep an eye on that and make sure that when those vulnerabilities go live, that we as an organization, plural, go into those people that we're working with and get them to assure us back, and then we can do some sort of technical assurance around that, pen testing, etc., to make sure that those infrastructures are as they say they are. And that should always be written into any contract that we take with a platform as a provider, platform as a service, or software as a service, or whatever it is that we're using, to make sure that it's secure and it's fit for purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I mean, Phil, I guess it's a similar issue you touched on, the supply chain. You're now going to be looking at the supply chain. From what Glenn said there, in terms of, all of this should be built into the contracts, you should have that assurance process, but it just sounds like such a huge task not, once you go beyond your immediate kind of operations to your supply chain operations. So how are you going to be approaching that when it comes to that next phase of work that you were talking about?
Sure. I was just going to, first of all, a slight riposte to the question. The assumption underlying that question is that if we do own the physical infrastructure, we can guarantee the sensitive data is secure. And that is a really strong statement to make, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I have built some very high security solutions in the past. At least one of them required getting a manufacturer to print some custom motherboards for us, where we had somebody physically watching the motherboards being printed, picking them up, locking them in a case and bringing them to a high security data center. I doubt very many government on-premise servers have gone to that level of assurance. So really what you're looking at is a sliding scale. How important is this? Are you prepared to pay all that money and take all that time to secure something, all the way down to, is this something that frankly a commodity service and a commodity product can solve for a reasonable amount of money for a reasonable outcome? So there is no good single answer there, but I would say if you're assuming that on-prem means more secure than the cloud, you're probably missing some of the benefits of cloud in that balance. In terms of the scale of this, the thing that the public sector has so we often in the public sector do things that the private sector can't, because it's either too risky or too complex, and it's the sort of thing they don't see as much benefit from. So public sector tends to step in and do it. When we look at the security of our supply chain, if I was a commercial organization with a bottom line and a top line, I would not be wanting to spend enough money to gain very high levels of assurance in my supply chain. I would be doing what I needed to do to manage the risks I saw. What we can do as the public sector is, through our scale and our influence, change the security of the supply chain to individual sectors through our guidance, our contracts and our influence, and that will then have a positive benefit to the rest of the economy. So it's not just that we should be sitting and looking, what is the threat to me and what are the risks I most need to worry about, but also there is some benefit there for us to think, what is the benefit to the UK for us to be doing this as well? And even if sometimes that falls out of our direct roles in public sector. But when it's big and when it's complex, it takes time. Yeah. You've got to be able to prioritize, you've got to identify the things that matter first. You've got to change people's opinions. You've got to wait for them to learn from their first mistakes. None of this happens overnight. Yeah. And so if you set expectations that you're going to take some money and a year later you've got it fixed, you're setting yourself up to fail. This is not a quick process by any means.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Well, on that, we've had a related question come in. Michael, you might want to pick this one up. So Raj Thakra has said, how can supply chain risks be managed, including confidentiality of data and knowledge management? Should they be reduced to the smallest of possible to limit third-party integration?
Well, I don't know that you're ever going to limit third-party integration. Supply chain, I spent a lot of time dealing with supply chain risks in the government. They tend to get very cumbersome very, very fast. And that's because as you start to dig into what your third-party exposure is, you realize that there is a vast web of suppliers when you dig into supply chain. So it's not only potentially the immediate supplier that you have, but they as well have second and third party suppliers. And the question becomes one of, what's your risk exposure to the, so this, the classic case in point, right, is hardware equipment manufacturers, which oftentimes develop the circuitry, but then outsource that for production to a third party fab plant. That fab plant makes those components along with multiple other components. Those then go to an assembly facility, generally outside the EU, the UK, the US. Then that is assembled, it's shipped into the country where they're going to actually sell it. It may be then further modified or final assembled. I mean, there's just so many moving parts there that it gets very, very cumbersome. Very, very cumbersome. That being said, there are effective supply chain mitigation methods that you can put in place. And again, I'll go back to the first part is understanding, what is your biggest risk, and most organizations, data is the thing that they deal with that is the most essential element to them. That could be their intellectual property. That could be customer data, that could be employee data, but generally that's the biggest thing. And so what is really important is understanding from the people that you're going to exchange that data with, how they're going to use it, what's the lifespan of it. You know, if you have life cycles for retiring data, will they adhere to those? Are you sending them the minimum data that they need to actually do their job and function, or are you just taking the easy way out and passing them absolutely everything? So that's probably the biggest component. I think you can be successful with that. You know, Glenn talked about the assurance aspect of information security, which is, you know, auditing your third-party suppliers to make sure that they are behaving in a way that your security practices actually stipulate, and those can be contractually levied against that third-party supplier. So I think there are mechanisms. Unfortunately, it's generally not automated. It's time-consuming, and it takes a lot of people and intervention to kind of follow up on. And it's something that you have to watch on a continuous basis. You can't just expect to set the regulations and then hope that everybody follows them. You got to continuously audit that process.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I want to move on to talent in a minute, but there's another question on this kind of topic, and it was aimed at you specifically, Glenn. And Kelly Zammit has asked, many years ago, we used to have complete information risk returns with our third suppliers. This was a request from the Cabinet Office. Can I ask why this was decommissioned, as I found it worked really well?
I'm not sure it's ever been decommissioned, if I'm honest. If you look at the security policy framework, the SPF, for those that are in UK government anyway, the SPF says, and I will quote it actually, is that arrangements to determine and satisfy themselves that delivery partners, service providers and third-party suppliers applies to proper security controls too, and then it talks about ListX accreditation. But so I don't actually think the requirement's gone. I think what's happened is that as time's gone by, priorities have changed. We've gone from worrying about not so much about our third-party suppliers, but more about other things. Mm-hmm. And then the wheel hasn't really spun back round. So I don't think that the requirement's ever gone. I think it's just that competing priorities have taken over, and as a result, it's fallen by the way. If that makes sense. Does that answer the question?
I think so, but Kelly, you're very free to come back if you don't feel like Glenn has answered that question. So feel free to put in another follow-up question if you would like to. But I want to move on as well to this issue of kind of talent, because I think certainly Glenn and Phil, you touched on this. I guess the question that I want to put to you is, how hard is it, do you think, at the moment for the public sector to recruit and retain cyber specialists? In particular, I mean, the thing that comes up in all of our webinars is, if you're good at this stuff and the private sector comes along and offers you a much higher wage packet, why would you not, having done a few years in the public sector, go over to the private sector? So I can see you all nodding and smiling at this one. I'm going to give you a challenge. Nobody has ever on any of our webinars been able to answer how you actually retain great people in the public sector over and above knowing that you're making the world a better place, which works to an extent, I think. But so I'm going to come to you first, Glenn, because you seem to be nodding the most on this one. Is this a big challenge for the Cabinet? Yes. And for the UK in particular?
Yeah, I don't think it's a particular challenge to the UK, if I'm honest. I think it's a challenge that every public sector organisation worldwide is going to have, because the purse strings only stretch so far, and we can only pay people so much money. And I was going to give you the cliched answer of, we kind of rely on people coming to us knowing that they're going to make some sort of change and do good for the world or for the country or whatever. I think the other thing is, for me, it's all, if you want to retain people, it's about making it a place they want to stay. It's not always about the money. If you've got interesting work and you're working on interesting projects, and we make it as seamless as possible, then people will stay. I think the issue we're always going to have, which you alluded to, is that the private sector can pay twice as much as we can for those talented individuals to go. I am seeing it the other way around, though, as I go through, as I get older. I'm seeing those that have been out in private sector who are wanting to make a difference coming back. because they want to make that difference again. They've done what they needed to do. They've got the money that they want. They're fairly comfortable-ish, in inverted commas, in pressures of common life as we are now, and they want to try and make a change and an impact. But I think there's an element of pay versus retention, which is something that will always be there, and there will always be that dichotomy and delta between the two. It's a hard thing. But yeah, we can get people in at the bottom through apprenticeships and all those types of things. But then what do you do in the middle? How do you keep them? I think it's something we're always going to struggle with. Phil, what's your thought on that?
So I think DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sport, for those outside the UK, in their annual survey, they identified that the UK adds 17,000 new cyber roles each year. And through apprenticeship and graduate schemes, we're adding 10,000 new starters to the industry each year. So each year we're looking to fall roughly about 7,000 people behind. I think when you look at that level of competition for people, and when you look at the fact that we're competing with big tech, although less so, looking at some of the layoffs that have been happening, and the finance sector, they will always have deeper pockets than we will. So even if we were able to pay more money, they could still pay yet more again. So assuming that we can go out to market and compete on a fair basis with other sectors is probably not a great strategy. And I've said this in every sector I've worked in. I was a civil servant 20 something years ago, and I'm recently come back to civil service, but I was private sector for a very long time. And we don't do enough to grow talent. We don't do enough to bring new people in who don't have skills and experience but do have aptitude, and we don't train them and we don't give them experience. And I think there is much more we can do in that space. I think there are a number of groups in our society who are not equitably able to access the cybersecurity profession, who are not represented in the cybersecurity profession. And I think we spend too much time writing job specs and assuming they'll come to us. I think we need to go to them where they are. I think we need to address some of their access issues to get them into the profession. I think we need to be prepared to invest in their skills and give them experience and take the hit that we will have a bunch of people who are not fully formed, on the basis that we'll have roles filled, and over time they will become the experienced people we're looking for. I think we also need to accept that people will move on. They'll also come back. I did. So, you know, the civil service is interesting because it still very much operates on a sort of a sense of a career for life, you know, and that employer. That is unique amongst the private sector these days. An employer more than 5 years is unusual in the private sector. So I think there might be a case of sitting and thinking, what is it we're actually expecting here in terms of sustaining security staff? We need to go out, we need to be more proactive. We've got an interesting position in the NHS in that we operate everywhere. Most cyber talent tends to be concentrated in a few cities because that's where most of the big paying jobs are. What we would be able to do if we went out and trained people and brought them into the system is give them jobs where they live, where their families are, where their lives are. I think, you know, the sense of purpose, which is not to be missed, the really interesting stuff we do in public sector. So the stuff we're doing around AI and decision making, the stuff we're doing around some of the mobile, you know, there are things done in the public sector that just don't get done in the private sector. We've got data that people can't believe. As a place to come and learn, it's fantastic. To do it where you live, where your family are, and to be able to come in without having to have gone through the university in the first place, I think we can open up huge sort of amounts of people who could become the talent we need, as long as we didn't then assume that they were going to work for us forever. And so we come an engine. And the other way to look at that is, if we do bring new people into the cyber profession, we train them, we give them experience, we lose a percentage of them to the private sector, it's still a net gain for the UK economy. So we're still actually improving what's happening. And I think that's the thing. It's no longer a case of thinking in the public sector, how do I fill that role in my organization? We now need to be thinking, what is it we're doing around improving access to the profession, growing the profession, and accepting the fact that people's careers are not always going to be with us.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Mike, I'm going to come to you on this issue of talent, but just to pick up, Raj has come back on the points you're making, Phil, and what you touched on as well, Glenn, I think, which is, can we value talent more with unique training opportunities, like providing people with the chance to be observers in meetings, for example, you know, help to grow these people? So put a bit of money into those kind of initiatives. Michael, you've worked obviously as a civil servant yourself now in the private sector. What's your experience of this kind of competition for talent, and have you seen any good practice in terms of how do you kind of attract good people in, and as Phil said, maybe keep them there, not necessarily forever, but keep them there for 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, and Phil and Glenn touched on most of this, right? I mean, so the public sector is never going to be able to compete with the private sector just in pay. That being said, there is, you know, I'll say a mission imperative. There's a kind of a more of an esprit de corps, I would say, that's inherent amongst most government entities, and you need any government entity that can capitalize on that, can create an environment where people enjoy working there because they enjoy the mission, they enjoy the people that they're around. I think that helps build a positive environment, and that certainly is something that helps to keep people around. There's other incentives. We talked a little bit about them, you know, bringing people in and being a training ground for people that otherwise wouldn't get that experience, and recognizing that you're probably going to lose people. But then I think this is the important part. There's got to be a flexibility in the public sector employment system that allows people to transition out for a period of time, and then allows them to transition back in. And maybe they maintain some semblance of benefits that they would have had, you know, if they had a certain rank, as an example, they're able to come back in with that rank when they come back, or some of those types of flexible employment capabilities, I think would be helpful in allowing people to go out and get that private sector experience. And then, you know, when they feel maybe a little bit more financially stable, they can come back and contribute and give back to those organizations. So I think probably the biggest piece of this is the flexibility just from the employment standard of public sector entities.
Thanks, Michael. Glenn, there's been a follow-up question on the kind of supply chain question, which I just wanted to put to you quickly before we move on again. And this is coming from Laura Collette. And Laura has said, if a supplier originally met security requirements but has since fallen short of those, what recourse or support do we have as a customer, considering we can't simply up and take our business elsewhere, and there may be several years worth of data involved? So I guess this is looking across the supply chain over years, you know, what happens change.
That depends. Without knowing anything more specific, I would say more generically, that's around how the contract would be written. And it's more around making sure that the contract is written in such a way that the individual organization is obligated to remain secure. And as a result of that, despite whether it's a new vulnerability or an old exploited vulnerability that no one knew about or whatever, but it'll be written into the contract, and then you'd be relying on potential breach of contract terms or those types of things to do that. And I do get the point about big data and lots of data, and you're right, it would become a nightmare to do. But I think if you're doing those regular assurance activities and you're regularly going into your third party and doing those risk assessments on them, then you should capture that quite quickly, hopefully.
It's all part of good supply chain management, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all about good supply chain management, isn't it? So it's maintaining that management and just keeping on top of that management and not really letting it lapse.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I want to move on to a slightly different question, which we had come in before the webinar. So this is about have things changed over the last kind of few years? So is there kind of best practice now around that any of you can kind of point to that you think has actually helped shift the momentum, so to make it harder for cyber attackers to operate? So are we seeing kind of more best practice around? And I want to add to that, are you frustrated when you look across the civil service, you look across to colleagues, the way they're operating, to different parts of your organization, that there are still very basic things that people aren't doing that they should be doing? So one, is there good practice now developing? And secondly, what are your frustrations in terms of some of the very basic things, hygiene factors that you would like to see being addressed? Phil, I'm going to start with you on this one.
So the first thing I would say is we often talk about the basics of cyber hygiene, and calling the basics is an interesting way of putting it, because generally why they are the foundations, or they're the elements that we build on for a strong cyber program, they tend all to be really quite tough. So, for example, a technology estate that has strong life cycle management, so that you get rid of things before they become unsupported, so that you make sure you understand your own versions that integrate across the environment. That actually requires quite a well-managed technology function. When we're talking about an estate that we can patch quickly and check and assure that those patches have worked, again, that takes quite a well-managed technology function. A large proportion of outcomes in cybersecurity can only be patched up to a certain level by the cyber team alone. If we don't have really good quality technology delivery, then all we are going to be doing is a sticking plaster across a big crack that's slowly widening. So there is a piece here around, we call them the basics, it's the fundamentals, it's the stuff that everyone knows needs to get done well. Are we doing our joiners, movers, levers process well? Are we patching? Are we maintaining the systems? Do we know what we've got? Do we know how it's connected to each other? It sounds like the simple stuff. It's not the really clever, whizzy AI trying to crack, nation state hackers who are wearing balaclavas in their basements, whatever they are. But actually, this is the stuff. It undercuts everybody. It undercuts international banking. It undercuts government. The only people that have tended, in my experience, to deal with a bunch of this have been the cloud providers, who effectively started from scratch on how they built a lot of their tech infrastructure and automated away most of the stuff that requires really good process otherwise to deliver. And there's a lesson in that for the rest of us. Not that I'm saying we need to throw away our existing technology and go cloud. I'm no evangelist there. But it's interesting that the only people who have consistently solved many of these fundamentals are the ones that started thinking, how do we build the automation in place so that it's not down to a person to remember how to do this? It's not down to the skills of an individual to do it well. Because these are things that are not, they don't sound hard, but they're incredibly difficult to get right. And it's a management problem, not a technology problem. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. Michael, you were nodding along there. Do you recognize there what Phil's saying? Are there things with all the organizations that you work with now from Rubrik, are there kind of these recurrent things that you see people should be doing that they're not doing? But also, is there best practice that are emerging that you think could be shared more widely?
We could have a separate webinar on just this topic, I think. But Phil hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, from my perspective, there's probably two fundamental things that keep getting us in trouble from a cybersecurity perspective. Number one, credential management. Like, we have usernames and we give out passwords, and then we tell people, well, you can't have an 8-character password, you got to have a 14-character password. Now it can't be 14 characters; it's got to be 20 characters, and it's got to be numbers and letters, and people never remember this stuff, and so they find one good password and they reuse it everywhere because it's the only one that meets the criteria of the systems we put up. So it's kind of self-defeating, right? Okay, so get away from passwords. Like, move to a multi-factor authentication, move to a biometric, move to a second factor, but get people out of the mode of having to remember a password, because a stolen credential is the predominant way that cyber criminals get into these environments in the first place. The second way they get in is, and Phil mentioned it, is just unpatched hardware or unpatched software. The problem is, when you operate at scale, kind of Phil mentioned, I think 2 million devices under management, when you get into the law of large numbers, 1% of 2 million 1% of 2 million is still a large number. 0.1% of 2 million is still a large number. So you're always going to be chasing, perfection. And when you're managing a large entity, you're just never going to get there. So what's the answer to that? The answer to that is segment and understand where your critical assets are. I don't want to parrot zero trust, but this continuously authenticating individuals when they're trying to have access to systems. Don't just, for years, I think in the IT realm, we tried to reduce friction, let people in and then give them free range everywhere because we were afraid of instilling friction in the user community. I think there's technologies today that can still shore up the environment, making it micro-segmented while still providing us the assertions that we need from a cyber perspective that you are who you say you are. And I'm not going to say it's going to reduce friction to zero, but it's going to provide, I would say, a nominal amount of friction that the users they're not going to object to. And I think organizations have to take that step, and they've really got to focus on identifying the core assets of their environment and really segmenting those and putting protections around them, and being okay to say, look, I'm going to authenticate you multiple times throughout the course of your day because I need to assert that you are who you say you are and you have access to the right data when you say you need it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Michael. Glenn, you've been nodding at a lot of that. Where you sit, do you advise across the civil service, some of these?
No.
Okay.
So my function is an internal function for the Cabinet Office. So CDDO, which is the Central Digital and Data Office, do the
Right.
PAN government, along with GSG when you're talking security. They've got a cyber team in there that does that as well. But I'm not going to labour the points that both Michael and Phil have, because they're both brilliant and they've stolen all my thunder. But what I will say is that one of the good things that I am seeing, it was, for example, is what's coming out of the NCSC. So things like the cyber assessment framework. And taking a more risk-balanced approach to what is an essential service and building resilience. I think this is, whilst it strikes me as being a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but resilience is a big thing for us, and it's all about remaining resilient and still being able to function and deliver what we need to be able to deliver as government, and using frameworks like the CAF, as it's referred to, which can be not just assigned against NIST, critical national infrastructure, all those types of things. It can be assigned against a normal organisation, and they say so in their own guidance. It's all about identifying what your crown jewels are and how do you make those more resilient to prevent your organisation from falling over. So that is definitely something that is for me, is something that I go to when I'm looking at these types of things, and I'm looking at services and I'm looking at all that type of stuff. It's what can I do to make that more resilient and make that function and make it more secure. And I use that type of framework to go from there. Yeah, Phil, go on.
It was just a quick one. So one of the things that we had to do when cyber first became a buzzword that took over from information security for a while was this sense of crown jewels, the idea that we'd identify the things of most value and focus our protection, which was a great idea. What we have found, and I have found through my career, is that traditional security doctrine focused on information assets. So we looked for our crown jewel information assets. What we tended to miss in that picture was actually a lot of our crown jewels in the public sector was services. They were things we did for people. And some of that relied on critical information assets were absolutely needed to find. But that's where the suppliers, the facilities, the people all played a part in how we delivered those services. And what we have found through the wide-ranging ransomware campaigns we've seen is everything that underpins a service can be subject to some form of disruption as a result of ransomware. So it's no longer just a case that the old, I say the old view because it wasn't that long ago we all started talking about crown jewels, but the old view that the crown jewels was information was a great place, but actually that definition needs to grow, and we need to think more about the crown jewels as what allows us to deliver the services to citizens.
Yeah, agreed. And that is exactly what the CAF is looking at more robustly. It looks at it in the round. What are those things that you need to do to be more resilient? Not just what are the IT systems or what just are the data. It's to your point there, Phil, isn't it? Where it's, if we lose this, how does that prevent us from doing this over here? Yeah. And therefore, what is the risk to that? And how do we balance that risk? And what do we do to make that work better? So for me, it seems like it's a no-brainer. And it's coming from the National Technical Authority. Why wouldn't you go and look at it? Why wouldn't you have a read of it? There's a lot of work on in there, and there's some very, very, very bright people in Nova.
We've had Sorry, thanks, Glenn. We've had a follow-up question on, I think you all touched on this issue of patching. So we've had a follow-up question from Raj on this issue. And I think to summarize the question, I think it's, how do you persuade people to do the patching in the short term when there might be an issue with kind of legacy systems that are a bit flaky and you can't necessarily test all the patches. So they're worried that by patching, they'll cause outages to systems. So is this, would any of you like to answer that one? Who would like to? Phil, come over to you on that one.
So I know a little bit about legacy systems, given my current role. If you can't patch an environment to reflect an in-use exploit of a vulnerability, your system is undefendable. It's as simple as that. You've gone beyond, is this a risk-based case for us patching or not? You have an undefendable system that you are now dependent on. Yeah. The problem here isn't how do you make a patching decision. The problem here is how do you dig yourself out of that hole, because your organization now has a massive risk exposure. Not that a patch will take out a legacy system, but you now have a legacy system you can't protect. And I think it's a bigger question. And I agree, I understand the pressure and the difficulty to make that individual decision about that individual patch, but it's a bigger problem there that you have just.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I want to move on to another question as well, which is about kind of how the COVID period has affected this kind of environment. And in particular, I think we saw during the COVID period an increase, I think, in cyber attacks. You know, we saw people were able to kind of shift and use COVID to create all sorts of new kind of phishing opportunities as well. But also a lot more civil servants are now working remotely or working hybrid from home. And I think we've had on previous webinars concerns from civil servants then that maybe by working from home, they've created new vulnerabilities in the kind of IT systems. So I just want your thoughts on, are there things that, you know, managers, individual civil servants, people who might be in the audience today, should they be worrying about? Are there things they should be thinking about? And has that hybrid nature changed the environment when it comes to thinking about how secure you are in your own personal operations? Michael, I'm going to come to you first on that one.
Sure. I mean, this is it brings up fond memories. When I was at the State Department, you know, 110,000 people operating in 171 countries, 400 physical locations. That was the scale, right? And seriously, in the course of a week, we had to transition everybody to working from home. Wherever you were, whatever country, you're now working from home. Huge technological challenge, but you know, the cyber threats, we certainly saw them. Here are the reasons why, right? We didn't have enough time to procure 110,000 laptops, make them, quote, corporately owned and ship them to people, right? So the traditional things that the private sector had already had, which is a corporate laptop with a corporate image, with a corporate endpoint response and detection thing, with a corporate VPN, those protection mechanisms didn't exist out of the gate. So you had to rely on people working from their home computer, maybe through VDI, maybe through published web applications, potentially no VPN. Those things were all exposing you, right, to whatever the Wi-Fi network was that the person had, whatever the peripherals were that were on that Wi-Fi, how that Wi-Fi was protected, what they put on their home computer. So all those threats created a great exposure for any organization that didn't have the opportunity to like buy, you know, laptops and ship them to people. We ended up closing down on those things. I mean, you ultimately end up, you know, forcing people through VPNs or buying them laptops, or, you know, increasing use of VDI or some type of, you know, desktop hosted in a cloud environment. So you ended up closing down on those threats. But yeah, definitely out of the gate, it opened up a lot of threats. And this, I think the particular pieces, you know, the private sector had operated this way for many years. Public sector switched to this relatively quickly in many organizations. And well, ultimately, you know, intellectual property theft was, you know, kind of the purview of cyber criminals in the private sector. Well, now they had this great opportunity to go after public sector employees in their home environments and use that as the way to get into these public sector enterprises. And so that was certainly, you know, a threat that obviously needed to be closed down. I think a lot of organizations have made great progress in that over the past, you know, 2 years. But that was, I think, the initial threat that we saw when we moved to the COVID environment.
Thanks. Glenn, your thoughts on this, and similarly, do you think now that some of those initial concerns maybe have been addressed fully?
I mean, I joined government mid-COVID, so in a slight correction to my bio earlier, you've got someone transposed the digits. I joined in 2021. I became a civil servant in 2021.
2021 or 2012?
Not 2012. So yeah, I'm. It was fairly seamless for me. My laptop was dispatched to me by courier. I rang up the telephone number that came with it, did all my logons, did all of that, got secured, had my corporate inductions, etc., and it was all done online. So for me, I think, yeah, we've solved the majority of them. I think we have the laptops, we have the VPNs, we have all of that. The issue around people's ways of working is another matter, because people have gone from being in offices to being able to just printing stuff off, carry it around, etc., and all that kind of stuff. So I think in the first instance, you've got a lot of people who want to still be able to print stuff off, do all that. I mean, thankfully, I don't think we don't allow that. Everything's done through our secure printing solution. So I think the majority of them have been solved. I think the issue around resilience is a big thing. People's IT connections, their internet, how does that work? And I think if someone loses their internet on their street and they lose their internet on the street for a week, you've got a problem right there, especially during COVID, but or anything like that. I mean, so yeah, there's issues are more around the resilience aspect, I think, more than the security stuff. But how do we address that? It's through good education. I'm not going to use the phrase awareness training because that really annoys me. It's about educating your colleagues, your civil servants, that these are the threats and these are the issues, and how can they make themselves more secure, not just about themselves at work, but more importantly, how do they make themselves secure? Because if you've got good cyber hygiene at home, you're likely to have good cyber hygiene at work with any luck. So it's I think that's the best way to address it. But I think in the main, most of the problems appear to have been addressed. I think there's just the resilience issues around how do you keep people working in a hybrid environment rather than anything else. I think now.
Thanks, Glenn. Phil, has this been such a big issue for kind of health and social care? Because I imagine there's probably one area where fewer people have been able to move to hybrid. Is that right? So you're still having quite a lot of people coming into the office?
So, I mean, we've got a workforce in the NHS of 1.6 million. Not everyone's a doctor, so there's plenty of challenges in there. Just as the pandemic hit, I was working as an advisor to a number of startups, fintechs and health techs. What was interesting was the transition from working in the office to working at home in all of those organizations. I didn't notice it because even in the office, we were operating a remote working capability. It just, we hadn't modern ways of provisioning and buying things cheaply and using services kind of got you there already. I then came in to be a civil servant specifically to run the NHS Test and Trace program. There's security aspects of that. We built an organization of, well, 6,000 or 7,000 people in the program, but an extended enterprise for about 50,000 people in 6 months. We utterly broke departmental IT systems and immediately went out and built our own because it was the only way we were going to be able to do it. And I think, Glenn's right. We had a bunch of IT delivery processes across government that were designed for a certain environment, people being in the office, being able to pick stuff up, going to a help desk, that just didn't exist anymore. And once you stepped outside of that environment, it became quite difficult. That said, the solutions were available. There were ways and means to do it, but it did really require a pretty root and branch shift from existing capability to capability. Whether or not we've kept some of that learning is more difficult, I would say. So I think we've slowly crept back to office-based IT, and I think there is a conversation to be had about how we can maintain some of that flexibility in our delivery of IT, because I think that enables resilience. A flexible IT provision enables us to deal with these sorts of happenings where you can't go to the office, or a particular area of a city is cut off because there's no transport, or whatever the cause of a resilience situation might be. You're able to respond much easier. But I take Glenn's point around home resilience. So my broadband went out for two days last week. I was on all of these team calls on 4G. Right. And I'll tell you what, it was miserable. Not only was it miserable, much less effective. So there is a question that as we move to more and more people remote working, that becomes our default style of working. What happens when we want people back in the office? Do we have the space for them anymore? Do we have the network capacity to put them all in the office anymore? And if we don't, are we relying on then consumer delivered networking capability with consumer delivered SLAs? In which case, are we okay with that? Some bigger questions to ask. It's not something I think an individual department could answer. I think that's a broader government question.
Well, we do lots of webinars on the future of work, so that's a whole nother conversation. But I can't believe how fast the time has gone. So thank you to the audience for your questions. It's really great questions that have come in. I think we've got time for just one final question, which I'm going to put to all of you, which is, you all kind of mentioned in your opening remarks and in your answer to some of those questions that we in the public sector will never be able to do everything. You've really got to prioritize, focus on those kind of key vulnerability, focus on those really critical national infrastructure areas. So my question to all of you is, looking ahead, what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges facing the public sector and facing civil servants when it comes to cyber over the next coming years? And what kind of keeps you awake at night, I guess, is what I'm asking in terms of kind of this final question. Let me see, Glenn, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Lovely, thank you for that. I think I'll start with what keeps me awake. What keeps me awake is our ability to respond in a timely fashion to threats and vulnerabilities. That's what keeps me awake. What do I see as what was the first half of that question? Remind me.
What do you think the biggest threats are going to be? So do you see it changing in any way? Is the nature of cyber attacks going to change?
I don't think the nature of cyber attacks are going to change. And the reason I say that is because if you look at what we were dealing with 10, 15, 20 years ago, we are still dealing with similar type threats to what we were dealing with 10, 15, 20 years ago. The advent of ransomware, that's still with us. It's not, it's developing, but it's not developing at a ridiculously large pace that we can't keep track. I think the geopolitical thing is the thing that I think will cause most of our problems and most of our threats. We don't know what it is that we're going to have to deal with in 5, 10, 15 years time.
Yeah.
In that space. And we don't know what the world's going to look like in 10, 15 years time. And I think in the shorter term, in the interim feature in the UK, the biggest thing is going to be around efficiencies, cost efficiencies, all those types of things. And how do we prioritize what we need to prioritize within the budgets and the allocations we're given? I think therein is the major change we're going to have over the next few years, I think. Yeah,
thanks, Glenn. Michael, your thoughts on this? What do you think the future, the next coming years is going to hold?
I think there'll be more of the same. Again, I'll go back to the fact that the cyber criminals have monetized data theft or holding you ransom to data. It's money driving this cycle, and until enough organizations put in place data protection mechanisms to drive the monetary incentive out of this, then we're going to see more of the same. That being said, I think that there's been a clear recognition by people now that they understand that cyber criminals are after their data. That's what they need to protect, and so they're working to do that. So I'm optimistic on that front. I just think that means that the cyber landscape will ultimately change once enough organizations are able to figure out effective data protections. The thing that I think, and look, I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to our government employees and our government organizations. There's great talent there. They're motivated people. They know the right things that need to get done. Sometimes they're just resource constrained in getting there, which gets me to the talent question. Being able to attract and retain the necessary cyber talent to make all of the things that we've talked about today a reality in the future. That's certainly going to be a challenge. And I don't know that all organizations are going to be able to go it alone. And so I might say that, maybe the model shifts over the years where there's a cybersecurity center that provides cybersecurity services for large swaths of government entities.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Phil, the final words on this from you.
Right, I've got some ideas. So I think one of the biggest challenges underlying future cyber outcomes is the preponderance of capital versus revenue in government funding. We can always find a bit of capital to buy something. It's quite hard to find revenue to pay somebody or to rent a service. Increasingly, the market is moving to service-based delivery, and we are going to keep trying to buy stuff with capital because that's what we can get in the spending review. So I think that's going to underpin our ability to be a bit more agile in terms of what we procure. I think the availability of quality on-premise software is going to undercut some of our sensitive agencies, because the assumption has always been that they would be able to buy the on-premise version and run it in a secure environment. Over time, more and more of our software vendors are going to stop providing on-premise versions, or the on-premise versions will be smaller, older, less well-maintained. And so there's a real challenge to sensitive government about how do we maintain access to quality software when that software cannot be contained within our environment. And then the very last thing is, as our integrations become more complex, so more of our environments integrate with each other, which is where we get our value from, the data flow that drives some of the digital value, it becomes increasingly hard to sustain the technology, because to change one piece means to change 80% of the technology of the environment, because there are so many complex interdependencies between the various versions and types. And I think we need to keep really careful eye on that. I think, were we able to have a mass simplification of software, we would have a net gain in terms of our ability to sustain our technology and to secure it. My worry is that we will only ever make it more complex at this point.
Right. Thank you so much, Bill. And that does, I'm afraid, bring us to the end of the conversation. I can't believe how quickly that conversation went. But just to say thank you to the audience again for sending in those great questions. I'd be hugely grateful if you could fill in. We'll have sent everybody who registered for today's event a short questionnaire. If you could take a couple of minutes to fill that in, because it just means then that we make sure we continue to give you exactly the kind of webinars that are most useful for you. And on the screen there, you will see we've got some other webinars coming up. The next one is looking at how governments can tackle illicit finance there. If you're interested in that, you can register at the link there, but we've got lots of other webinars on our website as well. So please do have a look at those. Thank you so much to our brilliant panel. I mean, you really have given us lots of your time and expertise today. So thank you so much to Michael, to Phil, and to Glenn. I know the audience will really benefit from hearing everything you said today, a lot of practical things that people can think about as well following this webinar. Thanks to Rubrik for being our private sector knowledge partner today. Just to say to everybody who has been watching today, we will send a link to you with the video of today's conversation. So if you want to watch it all again, or if you want to share it with some of your colleagues, you will be able to do that. And we will be writing up an article with the key points that were raised today, and that will be sent around to everybody in a couple of weeks' time. But thanks again to Michael, to Phil, and to Glenn. It's been wonderful having you with us today. I hope we see you again very soon, and I hope we see the audience on another one of our webinars shortly. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.